Today's product review is the Breakthrough Golf Tex ZNE Wedge shaft. So this is a very new product. They're known for their stability shaft, which is a similar multi-material construction where it's got a steel tip or the bottom half of the proprietary shaft that comes with, coupled to a composite top half to gain stability and stiffness to get consistency of delivery of the club head. They've brought this into the wedge shaft market. So with the ZNE, it's where shafts are traditionally, in steel, they're designed with a softer tip for a little bit more spin, predominantly in wedge shafts, or into a composite, all composite material, graphite, where it's a stiffer top half, softer bottom half. The principles of this is to keep the higher kick point with the stiffer top half, to keep launch low, and then a softer tip for a little bit more spin. Now, the difference with what Breakthrough Golf have done here is, as you'll see from this here, there's a graphite top half, and then there's a coupler in the middle where it joins to a steel bottom half. Now the construction of each element is a little different to normal, so it's a very, very stable graphite top half, just as with the putter shafts. That's to keep under the hands a stiffer profile, less deflection, more consistency. The steel bottom half keeps a little bit of feel in the bottom half, keeps a bit of balance in the bottom half, and we'll come on to that again shortly. And what they've also done is it's a Dura-Coated ceramic coating on the steel tip of the shaft. That gives a little bit of extra stability, extra stiffness, but also durability, and creates that kind of actually quite a nice looking kind of matte black finish. That also just to get a low glare flow into the bottom of the club head. So the other bit that you get out of this shaft is where the two parts join. Now, we've got a diagram that we're going to switch to now, which shows the construction of it. So you've got, on the left-hand side, the top half of the shaft, so very stable graphite. Your graphite, because of the extra layers of material and the thickness of material versus steel, you can get stiffer relative to weight. So partly the wider diameter, that increases what we call a hoop strength, the resistance to ovaling, which again, consistency, it's all about consistency there. And then you've got on the right-hand side that tip section we talked about, the steel tip covered with the black ceramic coating. But then in the middle, what you have is, you've got to create a join point, is an aluminium coupler. So what that does is you've got an extra 2 layers essentially of material. So one, it creates the join, but it also makes that section of the shaft 2.5 times stiffer, as you can see in the diagram, 2.5 times stiffer than a traditional shaft. The effect that has is it raises the kick point. It helps keep the kick point of the shaft that little bit higher. So if that middle section isn't bending, then the major flex point has to move one side or other. Now, if the bottom half's very stiff as well, then up it comes. You're going to get more load and more bend up towards the hands. So where the majority of the load on the shaft comes on. So the principles of this is all about consistency of delivery of the club head, just like with the putter shaft. So trying to minimize that deflection, minimize that torsion and twisting, so that the club face is delivered the same time and time again. So it will have an effect on feel. And this is one of the things that in wedges is, there's a lot of tech and there's a lot of talk about wedge shaft profiles, bend points, soft tip, soft under the hands. Ultimately, we all feel shots differently. So that stiffness is going to, from a science point of view, you could argue helps from a dispersion standpoint and take all the twisting out. And that, in theory, should hit a straighter shot. But ultimately, whatever the player does with the club face is going to override any resistance to twisting. You might lose half a degree, a couple of degrees even of rotation, of movement of the head through impact. But as a player, we're capable of moving a lot more than that. So whilst the science is there, and there's a lot that backs that up from that rigidity element, please don't think this is going to make you hit it straight every single time, because that involves a soft bit on the end. So slight disclaimer on tech versus golfer there. However, one of their claims is that it reduces dispersion. So from a purely physics point of view, if you take a shaft on its own, less movement, less dispersion. Ultimately, that's that. Anytime you can reduce the movement of the bottom end, it's going to create that. But because of the construction, there are also a couple of little knock-on effects. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hit a couple of shots and then just describe what that sensation is like relative to what we're used to feeling. So because of the multi-material construction, you've got a lighter top half with the graphite, you've got a coated bottom half, so a steel tip with an extra ceramic coating on, and no matter how thin that is, That's going to add a bit of weight. You've also got another material in the middle, so you've got plenty of extra material in that bottom half. So relative to, I put one of these together with my own, and this is the 115 that I'm using here because I use a 120 gram steel wedge shaft. With my own shaft in this head came out at D6. With this shaft in, came out at D9. So one of the things that you're going to have to consider with this is that balance profile change, because that is not going to suit everybody. I think that's part of where, in principle, feel for the club head equals control, in principle. But that's only going to work for someone who suits a heavy balance point. So there are some practical and swinging knock-on effects of this construction as well. No matter how well designed and structurally how solid it is, there are some players it will suit and some it really won't. So to swing with, obviously there's a lot of feel for the club head. And as we swing it, what you definitely notice is that rigidity, that stiffness. It's when you compare it side by side to a conventional, should we call it, steel shaft, it's a very different feel. And there are going to be players that are going to like that, there are going to be players that don't like that. So anyone who, like that, I get a little bit more attacking onto it. There are players who, if you're more of an attacking wedge player and you like to drive shots in, that stability, that stiffness is going to feel quite nice. It's likely to feel like you keep control of the club face. If you tend to play, shall we say, a slightly lazier, kind of softer technique, if I quieten this down, sort of a longer, slower tempo, one thing, and actually that one I call a little bit heavy, one thing that will be noticeable is if you're more of a dead hands, dead arm swinger, the heavier balance may not suit you. But you're also not going to get as much feedback from the shaft, all part of the design, all part of the science, but you're not going to get as much feedback from it as you will a conventional shaft. So these are things to consider when you're looking at this shaft. But if you're someone who plays a little handsy, little laggy, that weight down the bottom end allows you to drop the club in, know where the club head is, and the more I use the hands, the laggier I get, the better this shaft feels and plays. So from a practical swinging side of it, it's a very particular shaft. And no matter what weight, this is the same effect on swing weight in terms of making it heavier we've seen with the 90, the 115 and the 130 gram shafts. So in my opinion, I think these are going to suit someone who likes a more aggressive style of wedge play. And what we will see, if I sort of discount those last couple where I'm showing, there are a couple in there where I'm showing kind of a bit of how I hit them, but I'm going to just take those out of the data that we gathered earlier because I've been standing talking and gone in completely cold. And one of those was a little bit heavy. So let's take all of those out. So we're comparing actually kind of apples with apples from the shot data we used before. So one of the things that we can see, I did a test, a little bit of test earlier with 3/4 shots and then fuller swings. So from a dispersion point of view, this is where, and I have a slightly laggier action, a little more handsy action. So for me, actually, on the 3/4 shots, having lots of feel for the club head and that rigidity, the orange dots on the screen there are that shaft. The dispersion's very, very good. The white shots are with my own wedge shaft in the same head. So dispersion-wise on the 3/4 ones, you can really say, well, you know what? Actually, there appears to be a slight gain. Very, very consistent for that whole kind of overall dispersion pattern, a little bit more of a spread with the steel. What does happen is when we go to fuller swings, that's when that balance profile starts to come into play. So with the steel shaft, where it's a little more evenly weighted, very, very tight dispersion, spreads a little bit more with the ZNE shaft. So again, you'd be looking at this going, this shaft is going to suit someone who does not particularly want a heavy head for a fuller shot. It appears to be better for those shorter, more vertical, feely shots. If we look at some of the other data, we can also compare things like spin profiles. So, is there a difference there? So, and this is purely for me hitting and testing. So, top to bottom of the 3/4 shots and the two in the middle are the full shots, just the way the screen's displayed them around. What we can see is, the spin rate, average spin rate across a few shots in the 3/4 ones, you're looking at 60 revolutions difference. launch angle, 1 degree difference. So for me, and this is all about whether it suits a player or not, launch angle with the steel shaft, very slightly lower due to angle of attack being a bit steeper. When we go to the full shots, again, for me, you can see angle of attack a degree steeper, so I get a little bit steeper with the steel shaft. So the launch angle is a little bit lower, and for me, spin a little bit higher. This really is the dispersion side of it. I think there's no doubting where there's a sort of physics-based argument for this shaft. There's no doubting that stability and rigidity, the practicality from the putter shaft into the wedge shaft. There's an argument for it. The one note of caution that I would say, if you test it. Absolutely find somewhere you can test it, because theory is great, but in practice it's got to work for you. And I can see certain players this will really work for, and certain players that are just going to find they fat the ball because of that balance profile change. So lots of tech in it, lots of science in it, but very much a shaft which is going to be player specific. So certainly worth hunting out and trying out, especially if you tend to get a little bit more laggy, a little bit more aggressive with your kind of shorter wedge shots. I think there's definitely an angle for it there. But certainly not something that's going to be for everyone, because it's such a particular feel and such a particular balance profile. But technologically, to achieve what they've done, great. And I think bringing this sort of tech in from the putter shafts into swing shafts, and as it develops and they move it on, I'm sure this is going to get better and better and better, and offer more weight, more balance options, more feel options, as they can incorporate more tech. So a very, very interesting product. Certainly want to try to test out if you're someone who likes that kind of slightly more aggressive action, which we've got on the wall here. But please test it before buying.